Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and I'm really pleased to have the opportunity to speak about my own work. And as was just mentioned, since I'm responsible for organising the timetable as well, I thought I'd begin by letting you know that I picked the 6th of March today because it's Michelangelo's birthday. Today is the 539th anniversary of his birth in 1475, and dates are very important as you will see. It's important to remember how very long ago these complex ideas were expressed. So, what I'm going to talk about is a sort of a cosmological interpretation of Michelangelo's Last Judgment. And the things we're going to look at in the time available is cosmology in the Bible, the creation in Genesis, and the base on the flat earth view of the universe, which is that the good basically go up to heaven and the bad go down to hell, which is a basic concept. This carries over into Christian art and architecture, especially in the Last Judgment, because the Last Judgment is the one scene in cosmology where the three parts of the known universe, heaven, earth, and hell, are depicted together. Now, we'll look at Michelangelo's Last Judgment, where Christ is unusually depicted as a beardless Apollonian sun god in a circular cosmic design. And the idea that this could reflect Copernicus' theory of the sun-centered universe was rejected always on the grounds of the dating, because the fresco was finished in 1541, and Copernicus' Revolutions was finished in 1543. But we'll be examining that quite closely. Then we look at various sources that might have influenced the work, religious ones, literary ones, philosophical, and scientific, to show that it's my belief that sun symbolism and Copernican astronomy are actually key themes in the fresco. Now, before starting to look, I'll fill in some background on the Sistine Chapel, but the comment I want to make to start with is that this is really a piece of what might be called art historical detective work. Art historians have been hesitant to delve into astronomical texts, and astronomers are perhaps less familiar with Renaissance frescoes. But we're hoping that we can actually demonstrate that this was influenced by Copernicus with the knowledge, consent, and approval of the two popes were concerned. Now, just as a refresher or reminder for those of you who are not so familiar with the dating, the Sistine Chapel was built in 1475, the year that Michelangelo was born, on the site of an early 13th century chapel. The cosmological associations of the chapel are very evident, since it measures about 40 meters by 13 meters, which is actually 70 cubits by 20 cubits, which is the precise dimensions given in the Bible for the Temple of Solomon, which in turn was made in imitation of the shape of the universe, according to the Old Testament. Now, the chapel ceiling, if we look, this is the ceiling here. Some of these will be very familiar to you. The creation of Adam in particular is very well known. The Last Judgment is on the end wall here. Now, the ceiling was painted in about 1508 to 12, but on the altar wall, the monumental fresco of the Last Judgment was painted much later, in 1536 to 1541. So on the ceiling, we've got the creation of the sun, the moon, the planets, the earth, mankind, and so on. And on the end wall here, we've got the Last Judgment. So actually, the overriding theme of the chapel is the beginning and the end of the universe, the planet, and humanity, interpreted in terms of creation and Last Judgment, rather than the modern Big Bang and gravitational collapse. I don't know, there was a Gresham lecture on the Big Bang last night, which was very well attended. The problems are the same, even if the solutions or the interpretations vary, but the overriding cosmic theme of the beginning and the end of the world is clear. Now, first, a word about interpreting artworks or decoding artworks. I resisted the temptation to call this the Michelangelo Code, but interpretation of artworks can be very controversial. Art historical interpretation is concerned with the meaning of a work considered in the context of its time and place of creation. It's always difficult to determine the precise intention of the artist, but underlying meaning can be discovered by means of examination of the different sources, as I mentioned, that had significance to contemporaries and to the artist. It can be dangerous to read too much into a work or to force it into a predetermined scheme, but it's also unwise to unquestionably accept the traditional interprets of a work and repeat the usual platitudes. Michelangelo's fresco does relate broadly to the way in which the scene was normally depicted, but there are certainly very unusual and interesting features in it. Then I also want to fill you in a bit about the meaning of the Last Judgment, again, for those of you who might not be so familiar with this. The theological concept of the Last Judgment, as expressed in the Old Testament and in the New Testament, especially the Book of Revelation, is central to Christian doctrine. And in art, the subject is a prime example of the depiction of very complex dogma in a single image. Individual concern and collective concern about the possibility of life after death, the end of the universe, predates Christian religion, of course. But the idea of judgment of all souls at the end of the time is a key tenet of Christianity. Put simply, the good will go up to heaven, the bad will descend to hell. As well as representing victory over death for the saved and the threat of the Last Judgment, can also be seen as disciplinary propaganda for the laity in the absence of effective judicial systems. The Last Judgment was thus a very appropriate topic for the main wall in the most important chapel in Christendom. You could actually argue it as the most important single painting, but we won't sort of go into that too much. Now, Michelangelo's depiction of the Last Judgment was first discussed between the Pope, Clement VII, and Michelangelo in 1533, but Clement died in 1534, and the project was taken over by his successor, Paul III. Actual painting started in the summer of 1536, and the fresco was unveiled on the Eve of All Saints, 31st of October 1541. The fresco is based, as you can see here, on a dramatic circular design, where Christ is depicted as an Apollo in the center of this circular design, with a sort of a sun aura around him. This varies enormously from the traditional designs, as we shall see. I'll show you some examples of that. Now, the description on the right, in the midst of all assuredly dwells the sun, for in this most beautiful temple, etc. Some would call him the light of the world. He remains governing the bodies which circle around him. Actually sounds like a description of the painting. But in fact, that is a quotation from Copernicus' book, Revolutions, or De Revolutionibus Orbium Coelestium, that was published in 1543, 2 years after the fresco was finished. Note the publication date. And so it was published, although it seems to relate to the description of it, it was clearly the fresco was designed much earlier than that. So because of this, a link was never seriously explored. Possibly the most famous Michelangelo art historian ever, Charles de Tolnay, wrote in the 1960s that because of the, I mean, you can all read this, but you probably all read it already, because of the central place of Michelangelo's Christ as a Son, he says the artist seemed to come of himself of a vision which curiously corresponds to that of Copernicus, but he couldn't have known Copernicus's book. He also adds that this seems also to be heretical. But the idea that Michelangelo, as well as everything else he did, independently thought of everything that Copernicus thought of as well, seemed a bit curious to me. When I came across this first, I thought, I'm sure Copernicus was earlier than that, and I started checking things out. So, although it was seen as impossible, a case can be made for this. And to do this, we need to look at all the different things that might have influenced the fresco. Reasons can be suggested for the unusual depiction of Christ as beardless, surrounded by a sun-like aura in the middle of an essentially circular arrangement, as well as, and we know this, that so often over history, over the hundreds of years since this was painted, it's often been described as cosmic. So these are the sort of areas that I'm going to go through: the traditional links between astronomy and Christian iconography, traditional versions of the Last Judgment, interpretations of Michelangelo's version, And then the theological sources, the classical Italian Renaissance tradition, literary, philosophical and scientific sources. So looking first at traditional links between astronomy and Christian iconography. The links between cosmology and theology are very evident from the accounts of the universe and the creation in the first book of Genesis. In turn, Christian art and architecture were also linked with the prevailing official view of the universe, which was, of course, derived from scriptural sources. The links between astronomy and Christian iconography can be securely established. For example, the tradition of domed architecture. Domed architecture is actually based on the concept of the flat earth covered by the dome of heaven. And this is where the symbolism in church architecture comes from. And this is based on, amongst other sources, there are many, the biblical description of God stretching out the heavens as a canopy over the earth from the book of Isaiah. So this relates to natural eye observation. And this is exemplified by, on the left we have the starry, this is actually a view upwards of a dome at the Galla Placidia Mausoleum in Ravenna in the 5th century. And another example from Ravenna on the right is a 6th century example, which curiously has Christ seated on the sphere of the universe, showing that these are very cosmological approaches. Looking at more specific themes, the creation of the universe was also frequently depicted in art, such as the mosaic of God creating the universe at Monreale on the right, and St. Mark's, Venice, the creation at St. Mark's in Venice here. You can see here, this area here with the creation of the sun, moon and stars. Planets corresponds to Michelangelo's ceiling. And this sort of mosaic with God as creator was also very, very common. So these are just a couple of examples and there are many more, that serve to demonstrate the view of the cosmos in relation to the Christian tradition. And these examples demonstrate the important links between Christian iconography and astronomy or cosmology based on the biblical sources. Another astronomical feature of churches is the orientation. And the east-west orientation of Christian churches, with the altar in the east, is well known. Now, the Basilica in St. Peter's in Rome is exceptional because situated as it is to the west of Rome, the entrance faces Rome itself to the east. And so the altar is actually in the west. That's here. And Rome is over here, you see. And the Sistine Chapel here, the Cappella Sistina, has the same orientation. So again, the altar is on the west wall, which is quite unusual because the reason for this is probably that the Emperor Constantine built the original basilica on the site of an ancient sun temple, which was constructed with the entrance to the east, so the rising sun came through the doorway. But in fact, the Last Judgment was far more often situated on the west wall, which was normally the exit to the church, either on the outside or the inside, which was really acted as a stern reminder to the congregation on exit to behave themselves. And on the right here, this is what the Sistine Chapel looked like in the late 15th century before Michelangelo decorated it. It's quite interesting to note that where the Last Judgment now is, there were 2 windows. And you can see here the stars on the ceiling, again, show that it was always a very cosmological site. So if we go back to look at some earlier examples, and the way that cosmological themes were evident in both individual religious scenes as well as architectural design, the Last Judgment was very suited to this. So this example here is from the monk Cosmas Indicopleustes in the 6th century. There are 3 copies of this manuscript remaining. And he here has drawn, we've got the actual manuscript is on the right, is on the left, and an interpretation here. And you can see here where this is labelled Ye, meaning the earth, and this is the wall to the left, the wall to the east and the wall to the right, and the stars above. So this is actually Cosmas's drawing of the universe, which is shaped rather like an old-fashioned travelling trunk, which is very similar to the shape of the Sistine Chapel, and demonstrates the correspondence, the correlation between church architecture and the view of the universe. what is more interesting is that Cosmas was clearly aware in this diagram that the flat Earth wasn't the only theory. The ancient Greeks thought about a spherical universe, spherical Earth. But he explains very carefully in this slide that, well, it couldn't possibly be spherical, because then if you were in the Antipodes in the southern hemisphere, then the rain would go up your trousers, as it were. I don't know if you've got any Australians here, but I can assure you that doesn't happen. Much earlier than Cosmas, Plato, the quotation there, had already realized that because the universe is spherical in some way or another, we'll go into that later, the assertion that it has an above and a below and an up and a down does not become a man of sense. That's from the Timaeus. It's quite important to remember that the Timaeus, which was Plato's cosmological work, was the only one that was available all through the Middle Ages. The others weren't translated until Marsilio Ficino much later on. But the Timaeus is very important for this because of Plato's cosmology. Later on in the same manuscript, Cosmas draws here a cross-section of his universe. This is the waters above the Earth, which of course were used to explain the fact that the rain came down. But you can see this immediate and obvious relationship between the traditional design of the Last Judgment, with Christ at the top, layers of saints and angels coming down, and then down to hell at the bottom. So the correspondence between the view of the universe and the Last Judgment iconography or scheme or design is absolutely clear. The ordering and the organization of the complex scheme of the Last Judgment was thus achieved by relating it to the cosmological perception of the universe. Moving on, we can look at traditional examples of the Last Judgment. These are a couple of Romanesque examples from France. I'm not claiming here that Michelangelo would have seen these, but I'm just using this. There are hundreds of these to show how ingrained it was that you quite often got the Last Judgment in a west portal of a church, like at Vézelay or Autun. And again, this completely layered design with the ranks of angels and saints and sinners organized in that way. The same thing comes through a few Gothic examples I've got here of Notre Dame in Paris and Bourges, and as Gothic, they're more sophisticated perhaps than the Romanesque examples, but they still show this basic approach to the Last Judgment and the way it's arranged. And of course, in these, if you look closely, it doesn't show on these larger slides, but there's a huge emphasis here in the lower layers of people sort of being dragged off to cauldrons of boiling oil and that sort of thing, and the tortures of hell, which is quite significant. Now, moving on, we can see the mosaic examples in Italy itself, which Michelangelo probably was familiar with. We have an example here from Torcello, which is an island off Venice. Michelangelo spent quite a lot of time in Venice. Again, we've got the layered approach. And the example by Coppo di Marcovaldo in Florence, in the baptistry, in the late 13th century. So again, these are just a few examples to show you how very ingrained this approach was. Now, moving to the early Renaissance, Giotto's version in Padua, and it's important to remember, we'll talk about Dante later on, it's important to remember that Giotto was a very close associate of Dante in the very early 14th century. This was painted around 1305. And again, we've got these layers, but the cosmic allusions are clear because these scenes at the top refer to the biblical reference of rolling back the heavens, which is the reference from Revelation. So in spite of the intrusive window, he has still got this layered approach. The Christ is lower down because of the window, but of course Michelangelo got rid of the windows that he was faced with. The tradition goes on. We've got Fra Angelico and Fra Bartolomeo, other Renaissance examples which still relate overall to the view of the universe in terms of the ascent of the good to heaven and the descent to hell beneath the earth. And in general terms, this formed the basis of the scene's iconography for many centuries. But Michelangelo changed all this by introducing a revolutionary new design, There are features of the old traditions still remaining in his work, but by filling in the former windows to make one vast space, and it's actually 44 feet, 17.5 meters high, a huge circular movement overcomes and warps into these traditional features of the design. Now, the idea of a spherical Earth in a geocentric system had been known, of course, by the ancient Greeks and had been attracting attention for some time in Western Europe. The astronomer Pope Gervert in 999 was well known for discussing these ideas. But even before Dante in the 13th century wrote of a clearly spherical system, the idea of a spherical Earth in a spherical universe became increasingly accepted by the educated classes. The final conviction that the Earth was spherical stemmed from such phenomena as the shadow cast of the Earth on the Moon during an eclipse, the alteration in the position of the stars as travellers move south, and the fact that land not visible from a ship at sea is visible from the mast. Conversely, from the land, a ship goes out of sight before its mast. The voyages of discovery confirm this. Men like Christopher Columbus set out because they were already convinced that the world was round. But the system was problematic, because if you have a spherical Earth with the concept of going up for heaven and down for hell, well, what happens then? Hell actually becomes the centre of the universe, and this is clearly unacceptable. So Dante overcame this problem by having a dual system, dividing his universe into two parts, with a celestial system and an earthly system which is focused on hell. So the growing realization of the scientific inadequacies of the flat earth theory caused significant changes in the view of the universe in Renaissance Italy. So to return to the fresco, see where we have got a slight horizontal emphasis here, but this huge circular movement, actually where the saved are ascending to heaven on this side, while the damned are descending to hell on this side, around this central Apollo-like figure. I'll just mention here, this is what it looked like before the cleaning in the late 90s. And the brightness after the cleaning actually reinforces this aspect. And we can see that early interpretations or copy, this is a copy by Venusti in 1549, or the print by Rota in 1569, with all these rays coming out, it shows that this is clearly, it was much brighter when it was painted, and so the restoration actually restored it to its normal shape. And these clearly emphasize the sun-like effects before the smoke and dirt of centuries had caused the rather dark and dismal overall effect. We can also look at Michelangelo's drawing and the commission, and this is called the Bayonne drawing, has this clearly circular movement. And what's interesting about this drawing from the Casa Buonarroti is that the Virgin is pictured here with the moon at her feet, which comes from the quotation of Revelation 12, a woman clothed with the sun and the moon under her feet, which shows from the earliest designs in the 1533 that Michelangelo was thinking of cosmological ideas. In the finished fresco, the revolving arms, as I said, put everything in motion. But we do have these traditional features. For example, this is St. Peter here holding the keys, which is very like a very, very traditional concept. But Aretino, a critic who was not very kindly disposed towards Michelangelo, said that he hid the mysteries under a veil that they might not be understood by the vulgar. Even contemporaries recognize that right away. In the inner circle, we can see Vasari, the famous 16th century art historian, again emphasizes that the perception of this is in a circle. And it's rather like the medieval Wheel of Fortune, where we have the saved, compared with Michelangelo's fresco, we have the saved going on the right and the damned falling on the other side. With the Wheel of Fortune, again, the idea is that your Wheel of Fortune rotates and goes up again. But there are a lot of really unusual features in this. We've got haloless saints. This is St. Sebastian. We've got wingless angels. the saved being pulled here up out of the cave, which is very curiously over the altar. Again, we've got wingless angels, and compared with the damned being hurled down to hell. And if you look carefully, you can see things like the saved being pulled up by a rosary, indicating the power of prayer, or those being weighted down by money bags going down to hell. There's a much more psychological approach to hell, where Michelangelo's figure here, there are over 400 figures in the fresco. So you can find every emotion you're looking for. This sort of psychological hell, much less of the boiling oil sort of thing. And here, another very curious feature, which is quite well known, is that Michelangelo included his own portrait in the flayed skin of St. Bartholomew. Bartholomew was martyred by being flayed. And this again has connotations about the flesh and spirit and sloughing off the flesh and so on. There are allusions to Dante in the frescoes. There's Charon and Minos, who were the Charon ferried the boats of the souls across to hell, according to Dante, and Minos is also a Dantean figure. But if we look carefully, we can see the way. It's a bit difficult to see on these because I did these a very long time ago, but if you look at the circles, you can see how the areas fit quite precisely into circles. And there's also a lot of diagonals that also lead up to this point. All the figures flying up also lead to a point, and we'll look at that at the end as well. So what is the fresco really about? What is the hidden meaning or secret, and why did he do it like this? It cannot have been explained away by artistic genius or because he thought it looked nice. One of my favourite quotations from Michelangelo is, "I paint with my brains, not with my hands." So if we look at the Apollonian, the Italian Renaissance, and the link with the classical tradition is very evident from this statue. This is a Greek statue, but these are the sort of statues that were being rediscovered in Renaissance Italy. And also, the concept of the deity as a sun in both the Old and New Testament. The Psalms are noted for their light symbolism. The Messiah on Judgment Day in the Old Testament in Malachi is noted as a sun. There's the Sol Invictus, the sun as the judge. And in particular in the Gospel of St. John. And references to the Christ as the Son are also found in the book of Revelation in relation to the Last Judgment, as this last one here. His countenance was as the sun. This sort of philosophy also permeates the writings of St. Augustine and the emphasis on in the Catholic Reformation. That was the movement with which Michelangelo was very probably involved, to reform the church, to bring the Protestants back into the fold, rather than to persecute the Protestants, as the much later Counter-Reformation did. So, the idea of Christ as an Apollo actually was quite well-founded. The sun god, Christ as the sun god on your left, is a 3rd century mosaic in St. Peter's, which was actually rediscovered in the early 16th century. The timing all fits. Another example here is a sarcophagus showing Christ as a beardless Apollo type. And the idea was that by equating Christ with Apollo, it assisted in gaining converts in the early days of Christianity. Other examples from the Renaissance of beardless Christ, Castagno's Resurrection, Botticelli's Lamentation, and Dürer's Sun Christ on the right, show that this was a very ingrained idea, and there's a lot of evidence to show that people were looking at this. An example which I particularly like, I came across this in the Palazzo della Signoria. This is in the main square in Florence, where there is clearly a sun symbol here. And underneath, the inscription reads, Rex Regem Dominus Dominantium, King of King and Lords of Lord. So that was actually a main feature in the main square of Florence at the time that Michelangelo would have been thinking about the Last Judgment. So the idea of the centre of the universe is important to consider. So if we've got the T&O map on the left, where here Jerusalem is the centre of the universe, taken from Ezekiel 5:5. Whereas here, a typical sort of Florentine 15th century manuscript shows the earth as the universe. Although, as I said, this has the problem if you go down for hell of making hell the centre of the universe. So we have a movement here from Jerusalem as the centre to a geocentric, to a heliocentric system. And of course, nowadays we're looking at something that's perhaps galactocentric or acentric. Dante's dual system is shown here, where we've got the circles of hell here, and then in his celestial system, there is a separate system, and that's how he avoids having hell as the centre. This is a modern drawing from the Divine Comedy, showing the same thing. And again, the spherical universe coming in, we can see Giovanni di Paolo in the 15th century, and here in Di Paolo's other manuscript, his illustration to Paradiso 38. I'm afraid this is a black and white one, not colour. This is an absolute gold, this picture, so he's clearly seen as a sun symbol. And looking at the ancient idea that the sun held the central position in the universe, Dante was familiar with this, and he acknowledged that in his book, The Convivio, where he says, "No object of sense in all the universe is more worthy to be made the symbol of God than the sun, which enlightens with the sense of itself." So Dante's universe is clearly spherical. Some more drawings. Botticelli did a set of drawings illustrating the Paradiso, and you can see here that he clearly, too, depicts Christ as a sun in the centre of the Empyrean. And this picture, this gesture of Christ, is very similar to that of Christ in the Last Judgment. I think the gesture is very strange because you don't know whether Christ is sitting or standing or running forward, or whether in Michelangelo's fresco it's sort of a blessing or a curse. It's very, very ambiguous. So in his work, describing this point, Botticelli explains how he saw a point that was the centre of the heavens, and on that point depends the heavens and the whole of nature. In other poetry of the time, and including the poems of Michelangelo's and Vittoria Colonna, references to Christ as the sun are very common. Vittoria Colonna wrote, "He is the sun whose brilliance blinds our eyes," while Michelangelo often as a poet expressed a wish to return to the light of the sun or a yearning for the sun to get to heaven. So there's a lot of evidence building up here that sun symbolism was very, very prevalent at this time. Moving on to look at Michelangelo and Neoplatonism, it's important to remember these are portraits of the leading Neoplatonists of the time, Ficino, Landino, Poliziano, and Mirandola. And it's important to remember that these were patronized by Lorenzo de' Medici in his academy, in his garden in Florence. And Michelangelo was sort of adopted by Lorenzo, and he grew up there. He would have been exposed to this. And actually, Clement VII, who was the orphaned nephew of Lorenzo de' Medici, also grew up in the same place. So Michelangelo and Clement VII had known each other from boyhood. And actually, Paul III, the other pope involved, who had also been there as well. There seem to me to be far too many coincidences in this. Ficino describes, in his commentary on Plato's Symposium, he describes God as the sun in the centre of the circles of the universe. And as I mentioned before, the Timaeus was very important with the cosmology. And if you look at, this is Raphael's School of Athens in the Vatican stanza. And this volume is carried under the arm of Plato. This is Plato, this is Aristotle. And the Timaeus, so this is really beginning to build up to show how important it all was. In just a few examples from Ficino's work, because this is very much a summary of a much larger work, we can see how Ficino would talk about, particularly the sixth book of the Republic, saying that the light for understanding is the same God by whom all things are made, and he compares the sun and God to each other. In Plato's Republic 6, the sun is equated with the good, which is which is the deity, the greatest wonder in nature, the middle point of all that is, the chain of the world, the face of all, and the knot and bond of the universe. And there are some more quotations here which I won't read out to you, but it just shows how much has permeated the Platonic thinking. And the last one in particular, it sits as if occupying a rock in the manner of a king, is very similar to the quotation from Copernicus that I used at the beginning. So these are quite probable source material again for Michelangelo. And it's quite interesting to note that Ficino's tract on the sun was required reading at Krakow in Poland when Copernicus was beginning his studies there. So now to move on to Copernicus himself. Cosmology, the study of the universe, is now mainly considered as a very specialized branch of theoretical physics and applied mathematics. But in the 16th century, it was dealt with as part of theology, philosophy, and literature, not a separate scientific study. Copernicus's outline of his theory, Revolutions, was published in 1543, so strictly speaking, it's correct to say that Michelangelo couldn't have read the book. But it's not necessary then or now for anyone to have read Copernicus's book in order to grasp the basic idea of the sun-centered universe. In addition, the date of publications of Revolutions actually coincided with Copernicus's death at the age of 70, so the date of publication obviously had little to do with the date of origin of the author's ideas. The concept was, like most other things, first thought of by the ancient Greeks. And the knowledge of ancient Greeks, Aristarchus, permeates a lot of works at this time. Actually, Copernicus acknowledges his predecessors, people like Buridan, Oresme, and Cusanus, and also Leonardo da Vinci. There is a quotation from Leonardo where he says the sun does not move. The preface to Revolutions was actually addressed to Paul III, the same pope to whom the fresco was completed, was the same pope to whom the book was dedicated. So Copernicus was influenced by the writings of Ficino. He actually spent 7 years in Italy, going to the same places as Michelangelo did. They were in Bologna at the same time, in Rome at the same time. He was not a heretic. He was a canon of the Catholic Church, and he was quite possibly ordained priest. And he continually credits God with the creation of the universe, even though he regarded it as a sun-centered one. So his ideas originated well before the publication, well before his death, clearly. And in fact, he started discussing his ideas in public from the early years of the 16th century. Another piece of evidence here is that Giorgione's Three Philosophers, the youngest philosopher, is a portrait of Copernicus. And it's quite interesting that Sebastiano del Piombo helped Giorgione with this painting and then moved to help Michelangelo with the Last Judgment. So in his preface to Revolutions, Copernicus mentioned that he actually says that he had written the book at least 36 years before it was published. He didn't publish it because he feared ridicule rather than fearing persecution. And he'd been widely recognized as a leading astronomer for decades. And I've just got some examples here. He was at university in Bologna. He spent 7 years in Italy. He gave public lectures in Rome. He published a commentary in 1541. In 1514, the Fifth Lateran Council summoned him to Rome to help advise on the new calendar. There were satires and jokes about Copernicus in the early 1530s. And there's a record from the diaries of Anton Doni that the conversations of the common people gathered in the evening in the Piazza del Duomo were quite often about the new heliocentric ideas. And even Luther wrote a treatise against Copernicus, actually showing that the Protestants objected to the new ideas far more than the Catholics did. But Copernicus was born in 1473, Michelangelo in 1475. And so they both moved in similar circles, and actual quotations from Plato and from the Bible are very clear, very common in Copernicus's works. His ideas were popularly known, and his book was eagerly awaited and accepted without demur by Pope Paul, to whom it was dedicated. Neither the Pope nor anyone else in Rome seemed to be shocked by the proposed system, which made swift progress amongst learned circles. The very difficult feature of the Copernican system, that the Earth lost its central place and became no more than another one of the planets, had immense theological implications, but these were not generally realized until very much later. Copernicus's conclusion that the Earth was not at the center of the universe, but traveled around a stationary sun, eventually challenged traditional and scriptural concepts about God's creation and the place of humanity in the universe and the location of heaven and hell, which we spoke about at the beginning. It caused great anxiety because it also appeared to contradict common sense observation. But the real storm didn't break until the experimental work of Galileo and Kepler in the next century. Revolutions was not banned until 1616, 73 years after the publication of Revolutions and the death of its author. What is more, and what shows that it was neither impossible nor heretical for Copernicus's ideas to have influenced Michelangelo's design, is the fact that Clement VII, who inaugurated the commission, showed a high degree of personal interest in the theory. And this was recorded here on this manuscript, which is in the library in Munich. And the manuscript says that, I'm sure you've all read this by now, that the Pope gave me this book as a gift in Rome in 1533, after I had, in the presence of a number of notables, explained to him in the garden of the Vatican Copernicus's teaching concerning the motion of the Earth. So we can actually date this precisely because we know when Johannes Petrus succeeded as Bishop of Viterbo, and that was in June 1533, and September 1533 when Clement VII left to travel to France. So taken with, there's a 633 at the bottom here, although that might be a later edition. But we know that Michelangelo was in Rome in June 1533, and we know that he subsequently met Pope Clement at San Miniato al Tedesco near Pisa on the 22nd of September 1533, where the project was considered, where they discussed this commission. So discussion between the Pope and the artists, set against all this background of cosmology in art and architecture, of the sun symbolism in the Bible, of the sun symbolism in the Neoplatonism, which was so common at the time, and Dante's writing. That discussion between the Pope and the artist about the commission took place a matter of weeks after Clement had Copernicus' theory explained to him by a professional lecture with a close connection with Copernicus. After Clement died in 1534, the Vatican continued to show an interest in Copernican ideas. In 1536, Cardinal Schoenberg wrote a direct letter to Copernicus urging him to publish his theory. Some years ago, word reached me about this. I had learned that you had formulated a new cosmology and that you maintain that the Earth moves and that the sun occupies it. I entreat you to communicate this. So this sounds like, in November 1536, this sounds like a desperate request for more information as the painting of the fresco got underway. So the idea that it could be an expression of the heliocentric theory of Nicholas Copernicus seems to be entirely plausible. The Copernican system, which placed the sun instead of the Earth at the center of the known system, was understood by astronomers, scholars, clergy, and educated people at this time. It was not only well known in the Vatican, but quite simply not regarded as being in conflict with Catholic Church doctrine. In the flat Earth theory and the medieval thought, the idea that the sun was central in a mobile while the Earth hurtled around the sun. Actually, we're hurtling around the sun at 67,000 miles an hour at the moment. This was regarded as absurd. But wasn't it even more absurd to think that while the Earth remained at rest, the stars, sun, and the rest of the universe rotated instead? The realization that the Earth was merely a planet, like many others, that rotated around the sun, did eventually shatter theological understanding, because heaven and hell could no longer be simply placed as up or down. This caused the Church to prohibit the teachings which placed the sun at the center of the universe, but not at the time when Michelangelo was painting the Last Judgment. Seen against the tremendous interest in the sun, demonstrated in the theological, literary, and philosophical sources of the age, which served as background to Copernicus in the same way as to Michelangelo, the identification of God with the sun made the heliocentric theory the logical solution to the difficulties of a hell-centered spherical system. Copernicus' scientific theory seems to have acted as a precipitating factor to cause all these concepts to fall into their rightful place. The idea of placing God, personified as the sun, in the center of the universe solved the inconsistency of equating the deity with the sun, which in the flat earth or geocentric system was merely a minor and fluctuating cosmological feature. It also fitted in well with all the Neoplatonic and Christian concepts. Humanity had been taken away from the central point of the universe, but God was far more logically placed there instead. The traditional analogy between sun and deity was vindicated at last. Michelangelo was nurtured on Fitino and Dante, exposed to Catholic reform thought, and commissioned to paint a traditionally cosmological subject at a time when Copernican heliocentricity was receiving a great deal of attention in Vatican circles. From the scientific point of view, the fresco is important as evidence of the early acceptance of the heliocentric theory within the upper reaches of the Catholic Church. His interpretation seems to have developed out of the different areas of interest. And when you think about all this, it seems impossible for him to have conceived it in any other way. Just as before, the ordering of the complex scene was achieved by relating it to the contemporary view of the cosmological structure of the universe. This is Copernicus on the right and the fresco on the left. So the idea is that Michelangelo's Last Judgment to Copernicus's diagram is the same as Cosmas's Last Judgment to the then diagram of the universe. Just as one additional note, if we think back to the circularity of the composition and the two diagrams that I showed you, it's difficult to demonstrate this, but if anybody's interested, I've got some close-ups which I can show you if you'd like to come and talk to me afterwards. But the idea is where, in the circular composition, where is the center of the circle and why? And the thing is that to get a circular composition on a wall 44 feet high, what you would probably have done is used a rotating plumb line, and you would have had to bang the nail in the middle somewhere. And the center of the circles, you can do this at home by manipulating circles on a reproduction of the Last Judgment. If you center the circles on his head for intellect, or his heart, or his hand, or anything like that, it simply doesn't work. The circles, the center point for all the diagonals and all the circles are on Christ's thigh. And there is a mark here where a plumb line could have been put on his thigh. And when I discovered that, I thought, well, why is that? And I looked through all the references I could find to Michelangelo, all references from Dante and the Bible and Plato and everything. And I thought, no, and I couldn't find it. And I thought, it must be in the Bible and it must be in Revelation. And so I sat down one evening and I read the whole book of Revelation from start to finish. And it's there on the penultimate page of the Bible. It says, "And he hath on his vesture and on his thigh a name written, King of Kings and Lord of Lords." And the next verse begins with a reference to an angel in the sun. You'll probably remember that Dante's cosmology of hell is based on Lucifer's thigh. You'll probably also recall that this is the quotation that's in the main piazza in Florence as well. So just sort of summing up, in the Sistine Last Judgment, Christ is seen theologically, neoplatonically, and scientifically as Michelangelo viewed him, as King of Kings and Lord of Lords, the sun, centre of the universe. I'll be happy to take questions.